Now comes the fun part. We get to name acids and bases. Yes, they have some new naming technique, especially for the acids. And yes, this will be on the next test. Now, acids can be a little bit tricky. Not really tricky, but there's a couple rules you need to learn. First, there's two types of acids that you might have. You might have binary acids, or you might have what are called oxo or oxy acids. We're going to start with the binary acids. So here's that term binary. That just means there's two elements. There's hydrogen, and then there's some sort of a nonmetal. When we name a binary acid, we change the hydrogen. Instead of calling it hydrogen, we say hydro, and then we change the ending to ic. So before, we always change the ending to ide, hydrogen chloride. Now we call it hydrochloric, and then we use the term acid. So HCl is hydrochloric acid, H2S, hydro, got that prefix hydro, sulfuric, we added the ic at the end, acid. Now, one little detail, for this to be called as an acid, this does need to be in a water solution. If it's a gas or a liquid or a solid, technically you would still name it using the techniques that we had learned before. HCl would be hydrogen chloride. But if it's in a water solution, if it's aqueous, we call it hydrochloric acid. So you know HCl, you're familiar with that name. So use that naming technique to help you learn this schematic. Let's look at the next ones. So the next one deals with what are called oxo acids or oxy acids. Occasionally they'll spell it OXYACID. An oxo or oxy acid is one that has a polyatomic ion. So you have hydrogen, you have a nonmetal, and you have oxygen. In other words, you have hydrogen and some sort of polyatomic. And the name is actually based on the polyatomic ion. So there's two parts to this. I know I have 4 parts written down. I've given you a little bit too much information than you need. So how it's named is actually based on if it has more or less oxygen. It's not necessarily a certain number, just more or less. And that again is based on the polyatomic ion name. So if you remember on that polyatomic ion list that we had before, most of those names end with ite or ate, ite or ate. 8 has more oxygens, ite has less. Well, we actually use that last little bit to determine the acid name. If it ended with 8, we change that ending to ic acid. So sulfate becomes sulfuric. Nitrate becomes nitric. If it ends with ite, then we change the ending to OUS. So sulfite becomes sulfurous. Nitrite becomes nitrous. And then we have these two prefixes. Now these are already in the polyatomic ion name, so don't worry about that too much. Per means more. So per and ate always go together. So if you had perchlorate, it becomes perchloric acid. And hypo means less, like if you're have hypothyroidism, that means that your thyroid does not work enough as it should. It's too low. So hypo refers to less oxygens, and it's always used with the ending ite, which we changed to OUS. So hypochlorite is named hypochlorous acid. Oh, just remember, 8 becomes ic, ite becomes OUS. Let's practice a little bit. So here we have a bunch of acids for you to be able to name. And I promise on the next test, just like the last test, I'm going to give you some blanks. You got to come up with the name. I'm going to give you some names and you got to come up with the acids because I like to torture you that way. Now I am going to help you just a little bit on this series right here. I'm going to give you the polyatomic ion name. So BrO4, is called perbromate. BrO3 is called bromate. BrO2 is called bromite. And BrO is called hypobromite. So pause the video really quick and figure out the names. Okay, now I'm assuming you paused it. I'm assuming you figured out the names. Let's go over the correct answers. The first two examples are both binary acids, meaning it's just two elements. We add the prefix hydro, and then we change the ending to ic. So HF is called hydrofluoric acid. HBr, hydrobromic acid. The rest are oxyacids. So these are based on the polyatomic ion name. So we just change the ending to ic or OUS. So ate becomes ic, ite becomes OUS. The first one, and I gave you the polyatomic ion name, perbromate, ate becomes ic. So this becomes perbromic acid. The next one is bromate. Bromate becomes bromic acid. Bromite becomes bromous acid. And hypobromite becomes hypobromous acid. So we only change the endings. Ate becomes ic, ite becomes OUS if it's an oxyacid. If it's binary, you add the prefix hydro, change the ending to ic. I know, so confusing. Try a few more. Sapling has some great examples for you. Okay, so we learned how to name acids. What do we do about bases? Nothing special. You just use their regular naming schematic. Most of our bases are ionic bases, so you name them just like an ionic compound. The first element named just as is. The second part, you give either change the ending to, usually it's going to be hydroxide, you just name that, or oxide. So we have sodium hydroxide, and Na2O is sodium oxide. Remember, you don't use Greek prefixes whenever you're naming ionic compounds. If it's a molecular base, you use the molecule name, and really the only one that we talk about in Chem 1 is just ammonia, NH3, so you just call it ammonia.